Hey everyone. Today we're floating gently into the Viking Age, a time when raids were frequent, kings were fragile, and human resources management mostly meant deciding whether to ransom someone, enslave them, or, if you were in a really bad mood, sacrifice them to the gods. When we imagine the Vikings, we usually picture them as, well, a little too cinematic. Endless horns on helmets, though of course the helmets didn't have horns. Perfectly braided beards, probably styled by Hollywood interns. In reality, the Viking Age was a patchwork of farming communities, small chieftains and opportunistic sea raiders. And like all raiders, they were less interested in winning epic wars than in collecting useful things. Gold was nice, silver was better, livestock was surprisingly popular, but the most valuable prize, and perhaps the most awkward to deal with, was people. And so the question arises, what exactly happened to all those unlucky prisoners of war? Let's begin with the practical option, ransom. If you were captured by Vikings and you happened to have a wealthy family, congratulations, you just became an investment. Captors would send word back home, usually through networks of traders, that they were holding on to a particular monk, noble, or occasionally bishop. And if the family could cough up the silver, you might actually be returned, slightly traumatized, but otherwise intact. Ransoming became so common that some monasteries, like the poor, frequently raided ones in Ireland, started budgeting for it. Imagine being a medieval accountant, balancing the books. Roof repairs, sheep feed, annual Viking kidnapping fund. It's not exactly an inspiring line item, but it was necessary. But not everyone was ransom material. If you were, let's say, a farmer's son from Northumbria, with very few coins to your family's name, your chances of a quick reunion weren't great. Instead, you were probably absorbed into the Viking slave economy. Yes, slavery. The Norse word was thrall, which rolls off the tongue almost too casually for something so grim. Thralls could be men, women, or children, anyone unlucky enough to be on the losing end of a raid, and they were traded, sold, or kept as household labor. What's particularly calming, if we can use that word here, is how ordinary this was. Thralls were not a shocking anomaly. They were part of the economic backbone of Viking society, which meant that a captured prisoner could spend the rest of their life tending fields, hauling timber, or doing the chores nobody else wanted. If you're picturing glamorous slave markets with exotic silks and dramatic bidding wars, dial that back. It was more often muddy, unremarkable, and thoroughly depressing. Now let's gently drift into the darker corner of this story, because sometimes prisoners weren't ransomed, and they weren't enslaved. Instead, they were sacrificed. Viking religion, as you may know, had a certain fondness for blood rituals. Captives could be offered to Odin or Freyr, or whomever the local chieftain was trying to impress. And while historians still debate how often this really happened, there are enough accounts, some from Viking sagas, others from horrified outside observers, to suggest that it wasn't entirely rare. The most infamous ritual was the so-called blood eagle, a delightfully gruesome punishment in which the ribs of a captive were supposedly spread outward like wings. Now, whether this was a real thing or just poetic exaggeration remains unclear. Some scholars think it's more myth than fact, like the medieval version of a horror story parents tell their kids to behave. But if it did happen, let's just say it wasn't the kind of fate you'd want on your Viking bucket list. Still, for most captives, life wasn't quite so spectacularly unpleasant. It was more quietly miserable. Women in particular were highly prized, not just as laborers, but also as concubines or in some cases wives. Viking society had flexible views on where brides could be sourced, and kidnapped from abroad was not an uncommon answer. This added an awkward international flavor to Viking families. Imagine your neighbor's new wife trying to make small talk in a language she didn't know, while quietly wondering how her monastery was doing back home. Some women did eventually assimilate into their new communities. Archaeological evidence suggests that foreign women sometimes became respected matriarchs in later generations, which is a reminder that history is not always neat. A captured prisoner could become a grandmother whose descendants thought of themselves as fully Norse. And then there were the children. If captured young, children were often absorbed seamlessly into Viking households. They grew up speaking Old Norse, learned to farm or raid, and probably forgot most of their early lives. It's a melancholy thought that entire childhood identities were erased in the shuffle of raids, But it also explains how Viking settlements expanded so quickly. Kidnapped populations quietly replenished their numbers. One medieval chronicler even complained that the Vikings were stealing the future of Christendom, which, while a dramatic phrasing, wasn't entirely wrong. A generation of kidnapped children could grow up more Norse than their parents ever were. Let's not forget the occasional political prisoner. Vikings didn't just raid for loot, they also got entangled in European politics. Sometimes they took hostages as guarantees of peace treaties. A chieftain might agree not to raid a kingdom, provided he could hold on to a few royal relatives as collateral. This was not a comfortable role to play. Being a hostage meant living in the awkward limbo of a very long sleepover you didn't sign up for. Well-fed usually, but always aware that your survival depended on other people not breaking their promises. Some hostages did rather well, treated almost like noble guests. Others less so. It depended on the mood of the captors, which frankly was not a reliable mood to bet your life on. It's tempting to imagine that captured prisoners dreamed constantly of escape, but realistically, where would they go? A monk from Ireland dropped into a Danish village wasn't going to blend in very easily, and if you tried to run, you'd likely be caught quickly, since local communities were close-knit and highly suspicious of unfamiliar faces. So most prisoners probably resigned themselves to their fates, work the fields, serve the household, raise children who might never know where their grandparents were buried. Life went on quietly, under the shadow of someone else's god. Now, it's worth noting that Viking prisoners weren't unique in this. Almost every medieval culture treated captives the same way: ransom, slavery, or death. The Vikings just happened to be particularly efficient at it, thanks to their boats and their entrepreneurial sense of plunder. And while later European chroniclers liked to paint them as uniquely savage, the truth is that much of Christendom was playing the same game. Knights captured in battle could be ransomed. Peasants often became slaves. Even the Byzantines weren't above decorating their city with unfortunate captives. So the Viking system wasn't an outlier. It was just another reminder that medieval life was precarious, and losing a fight could rewrite the rest of your existence. And so, what happened to prisoners of war in the Viking Age? Some were ransomed, returning home with stories their grandchildren would half believe. Some became thralls, laboring for families that didn't speak their language. Some were sacrificed in rituals that may or may not have actually existed outside of poetry. And many, perhaps most, were absorbed into the Norse world, vanishing into its bloodlines, its households, and its history. Their stories are mostly silent, bones in a grave sometimes showing signs of foreign origin, place names that hint at outsiders, and the occasional saga reference to a woman taken from the West.